So where would we be in a conference about intelligent health without a discussion of intellectual property protection? And we have a really wonderful panel for you to discuss that, in particular expertise. We have been sort of holding our breath all morning that Congressman Lungren was going to be able to join us because there are votes happening pretty much nonstop on the Hill. And if you could take your conversations to the back so we can, and come forward so we can begin our next panel. Congressman Lungren, I really had the pleasure and the privilege of getting to know not only Congressman Lungren, but his lovely family. His son, Jeff, is our Director of Communication. Had the chance to meet several times his lovely wife, Bobby, and also his daughter, Kelly Lungren McCollum, is the Chief of Staff for Congressman Fortenberry. And Congressman Fortenberry asked me to be in the House gallery last Sunday evening to actually watch the final debate on the health reform on the floor of the House. Congressman Lungren is a member of the House Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, and he is a rare member of Congress that really has an in-depth understanding of the issues that impact the economy from many different perspectives, and yet an even deeper knowledge of the subjects of national security and how the judicial system works as well, having served also for 8 years as the Attorney General of the state of California. He also is uniquely a Republican who has been elected from 2 different districts in the state of California. So it shows not only his political savvy, but his understanding of these issues. And we're really delighted to have you with us, Congressman Lungren.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you for allowing me to take some time out from saving the country, as everybody thinks that's what we're doing. Excuse me. First of all, let me observe that the Congress over the last weekend has taken upon itself the power to direct 1/6 of our national economy, in my judgment, to expand government control over our healthcare system and require individuals to purchase health insurance as an individual mandate. You may have noticed a number of the attorney generals have had some, of the states have had some difference of opinion on that. My own opinion is if we, the federal government, can mandate that you must buy a product, whether you want to or not to, from another private individual or entity, as a condition of remaining in legal status within the United States, then there is virtually nothing we cannot require you to do. If, in fact, that is a matter of interstate commerce, and we know that recent government studies have suggested a real problem with obesity in this country, would there be less of a constitutional power that we would have to command that you buy a membership in a health club so long as they met certain federal standards? So I think that is a real issue that people are going to have to seriously take into consideration. And I would have to say the response to this whole argument in the Congress, I call it the bloodletting over this issue, has divided the Congress in a way that I have not seen in all my years. And I first came to Congress in 1979, was there for 10 years, left for 16, came back. In that entire expanse, we've had some considerable debates over issues, war, what we should do in Europe with respect to missiles when the Soviet Union was still a power, all sorts of things. I have never seen anything divide the parties as this issue has. But in stark contrast to that, the issue of protecting intellectual property rights in order to enhance the incentives for innovation in healthcare is one over which I think we have a possibility of reaching a strong consensus in the Congress. One of the reasons is it is absolutely constitutional. Section 8 of Article 1 of our Constitution provides these words: "The Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their respective writings and discoveries." An exceptional idea that our founding fathers had. a clear constitutional mandate. The idea that we would have, or we as a society would benefit from the creativity of the human spirit, was the genesis of a protected status for a period of time for new ideas, new inventions, and similarly, works of art or literature. And the thought was that if you protected this as a piece of property, much like land, you would engage people to take risk that they might not otherwise take. And so Congress has an indispensable, essential role in generating a proper legal environment within which innovation through new discoveries might take place. If we have learned anything from this week's vote on health care reform, it is that our health care delivery system will now be subject to vast increases in government intervention. I don't believe that's a good thing. But nonetheless, at the same time, the American people have come to expect a rapid response from the private sector to meeting the demand for new and better cures for the things that ail them. And it is American ingenuity that has resulted in life-saving medical breakthroughs in the U.S., but has driven innovation across the globe. And that's one of the things we have to understand. We have been the leaders in it. We are not the only ones who engage in it, but we are the leaders, have been the leaders, and I believe must be the leaders if we are to get the advances that are out there. Diseases that amounted to death sentences just a decade ago are now treatable. Americans are living longer. They are enjoying a quality of life unparalleled in human history. And for this, I believe we can give a nod to our founders, in addition to those in the white coats here who take those ideas and apply them on an individual basis. For our founders who understood the necessity of protecting intellectual property rights for the public good. The need for increased productivity in the health sector is obviously heightened by what I would call the coming demographic tsunami facing our nation. From the year 2000 to the year 2030, the number of Americans over 65 will have doubled to over 72 million, which will represent nearly 1/5 of the population. Not only are we becoming an older America, but thanks largely to medical advances, we're living longer, more productive lives. So the impact of innovation on healthcare was brought home recently by a study from Columbia University, which concluded that between 1980 and the year 2000, new medicines entering the market were responsible for a 40% increase in life expectancy. It wasn't the government that gave that to you. It was new ideas that became applicable to those of us as individuals. The CEO of Eli Lilly cashed out this idea in a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, where he calculated that for every year that life expectancy has increased, 5 months of that year can be attributed to the availability of new medicines. That means we live in a whole new world. How disappointing then that medical innovation, along with other innovation, which is at the forefront of so much of the changes in our lives, has not been at the forefront of the debate on healthcare reform in the Congress. I've heard nary a word about that. As we've talked about everything else, we've forgotten about the positives of our healthcare system. I'm so sick and tired of hearing on the floor of the House about all the deficiencies of our system. And I look around and I see people are healthier. I mean, I sit in the Congress as one who's had the recipient of an artificial hip. I see some of my members who rarely talk about it, who have 2 artificial hips. George Miller comes to mind. My good friend John Dingell. But to listen to what they would say, you would believe that in fact we are the backward country. I hear these quotes from the WHO that we are the 37th best country, and then I look at some of the countries that are ahead of us, and I don't know anybody in the United States who would go to those countries to receive their medical care on a regular basis or even for a single operation. But if you look at what we just passed this week, you will see tax and distributional disincentives contained within the health care bill. Hopefully we can adjust some of those. But because of that, it is even more important that the incentives inherent in the protection of intellectual property be respected and understood and promoted. So what then is Congress doing to ensure that the protections are in place that will induce medical innovation so that our shared goals of cost containment and assuring access to quality care and treatment can be attained? For some of you who may have watched the Congress over the last couple of years in this, you will know that legislation has been introduced in both the House and the Senate that would bring about substantial changes in our patent system. The larger patent reform package moving through the Congress is focused on changes in the bill that Senators Leahy, Sessions, Hatch, Kyle, and Feinstein have recently moved through the Senate Judiciary Committee. The significance of this at this point in time, in my judgment, is that it appears my cell phone's over there. So the significance of this is that H.R. 1260, which passed the House as H.R. 1908 in the last Congress, is unlikely to be the starting point of the debate. And the reason is we're tired of sending our bills over to the Senate and having them languish. What we believe is if the Senate can get their act together, that will be the engine that finally gets over to the House so that we can work on it. This is not to suggest that those of us in the House Judiciary Committee are going to remain idle, but rather the most likely scenario is that the principals of our committee will sit down with Senators Leahy and Sessions to determine whether it is possible to move forward with a bill that can pass both houses. The interesting thing is we have a debate between the pharmacological industry on the one hand and certain elements of high tech on the other, and it has to do with how you can attack a patent infringement, and they actually exist in two different universes, and as a result they have different approaches to how we work with it. And that has been probably the reason we didn't get patent reform over the last several years. Last year, or last Congress, when we passed it out of the House, we did it to move it along, knowing that we didn't have a completed package, but hoping that when we got on the Senate side, you would have these two colossals come together and realize that it would be better if we reformed the patent process. They were unable to do that. But let me say, another concern affecting the prospects for any patent legislation results in the impact on the manner in which the stakeholders are, in fact, affected by the provisions. As I say, the different business models of the high-tech industry and the pharmaceutical industry have historically produced very different responses to patent legislation. Now, in addition to overall patent reform, we're also looking at legislation dealing with what we call biosimilars or follow-on biologics. Now, this is a very important concept. It is what is the proper period of time for which you can have exclusivity with respect to your invention. How long will that patent actually protect you? In other words, how long can you keep those before generics come online? And oftentimes we talk about in the debate about generics, and I believe they serve a very useful purpose, but if you stress generics over the original idea or the original product, you don't get as many original products. And so it's always a balancing act. There is no absolute in this regard. It is estimated that more than half of new drugs in the next few years may likely be biologics. Two competing bills have been introduced in the House, each of which would offer vastly different degrees of intellectual property protections. On March 11 of last year, Congressman Henry Waxman introduced legislation that would provide market exclusivity for a maximum of 7.5 years. While this might speed the arrival of copied versions of some medicines, there are those of us, and I am among them, who believe that it would kill critical incentives to discover and develop them in the first place. So as an alternative, Congressman Anna Eshoo from Northern California has put forth a bill that offered up to 14 years of patent protection. The Eshoo language was actually included in the health care reform package that passed out of the House, but unfortunately it was not part of the Senate bill that we then voted on this past weekend and is not in the bill as we see right now. I'm a co-sponsor of the SU bill and remain hopeful that we'll see it pass before the close of this Congress. Another issue that you might keep on your radar screen is this. It really looms on the horizon as a potential firestorm, and it relates to the challenges posed to intellectual property in the world's largest market, the People's Republic of China. The most recent example I have for you relates to the pharmaceutical industry. Patent rules imposed on February 1st of this year forced foreign drug companies to license production to local companies at prices fixed by the Chinese government. Now, although it's my view that the expansion of our trade and our economic relationship with China has on the whole been positive for both countries and the global trading system in general, this action is very disturbing because as they become a greater power in the global economy, they have greater influence. And I'm concerned that this may very well augur a potentially ominous rise in the influence of protectionist elements within the PRC and therefore in the world. And for purposes of discussion today, I think it could be characterized as nothing less than an expropriation of property rights with the consequent adverse effects on innovation. Thus, the efforts by the Chinese government to protect domestic producers by expropriating royalties presents us with a very new challenge, both to the liberalization of trade envisioned by the World Trade Organization as well as property rights and innovation. I can tell you already that my office has received complaints from American companies operating in China over this new development, and I'm certain that my office is not alone on this. So I look at this as one of the potentially explosive issues out there that we need to watch carefully. Finally, it seems to me we cannot forget about the correlation between medical innovation and jobs. Studies have shown that small firms in particular rely heavily on a robust patent protection system. As a Congress, I believe that we have to work to ensure that the innovators have protections that will incentivize them to continue to take risks, to develop the treatments as well as create the jobs so desperately needed now and in the future. I understand a prior speaker talked about the need for risk-taking, the environment for innovation. Let me just say, some 20 years ago when I was the vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, I did a survey around the country of venture capitalists. And I also held hearings around the country to try and figure out why did Silicon Valley develop in Northern California rather than Chicago or rather than somewhere else. Because if you really come out of World War II and you look at it, you would have presumed that it would be Chicago. And it was the interconnection of outstanding educational institutions, very bright innovators who were willing to leave their academic cocoon to take risk, but they had to be joined with capital risk takers. If you didn't have that, you didn't have the advances that took place. And for some reason it was crystallized in Northern California at that time. I like to think as a California native it was because of the risk-taking attitude of Americans who happened to grow up in California. But the fact of the matter is it developed there. And one of the things that bothers me the most in this debate is on healthcare is we point to villains. I mean, first of all, we tried to make the doctors villains by saying that they were taking out tonsils that shouldn't be taken out, and that didn't go over very well. Then we looked to insurance companies. That's worked pretty well. We've managed to demean them and suggest if you make a profit, there must be something wrong with you, because only the government with the passion and the compassion of the Internal Revenue Service could possibly be the one to provide this for you. But we have lost the whole question of how do you get innovation? You get innovation by attracting people who are willing to take risk. And one of the things that we have to be reminded of is 25 years ago we had a debate in this country of whether we should go to national industrial policy, which was being followed by Japan, versus what we did. And I remember those debates in the Joint Economic Committee. And the whole idea in Japan and the national industrial policy was the government had the ability to decide who the winners were going to be. And they would then direct capital only to 5 winners. In America, the idea was you'd have 100 people who wanted to take the plunge and try and figure it out. Now remember, the numbers are against those 100. 70 of them are not going to succeed. 30 at best will succeed. But those 30 will give you 30 good ideas versus the total potential of 5 in the Japanese National Industrial Policy approach. And so those two different views of the world, I think, benefited us in far greater ways. However, the question is, how do you get people to continue to risk when the chances are against them? It's because the bonus or the payoff at the end is great enough to continue to attract them. Or to use another analogy, if you didn't give out gold medals at the Olympics and everybody got a participation medal, would you see the kinds of records set that we see? And we lose sight of that in tax policy, and we lose sight of that if we don't protect intellectual property, because we don't understand people will risk if they believe the potential benefit is out there, even though the odds are against them. That's the genius of our system. And I hope we have not destroyed that by the approach we're taking with overall health care right now. And to the extent that we can repair the damage done, we will benefit from it in ways that we cannot even understand today. Thank you very much.
How incredibly refreshing it is to have a member of Congress in senior positions who understands that it's not Congress who should be getting credit for changes in our healthcare system, but doctors and patients and innovators and investors and people who take risks to do the right thing every day. Thank you, Congressman Lungren, for your leadership and vision, and may you prevail. I will like to invite Dr. Mark Esper, who I knew from the time when both of us were at the Heritage Foundation. I think everybody cycles through Heritage at one point. Who's Executive Vice President now of Global Intellectual Property, the Global Intellectual Property Center at the Chamber of Commerce, and also Vice President for the Europe and Eurasia Department. He is an expert in new technologies. He's been actually spent time with the aerospace industry as their executive vice president. He was the director of national security affairs for Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, and had a number of positions in the policy area, the policy community, to really further the concept of allowing innovation to be nourished and furthered through the political process rather than impeded. Mark.
Thank you, Grace Marie. Thank you for that introduction. You've certainly organized a wonderful program today, and it's been fantastic. Unfortunately, you gave me a tough act to follow with Congressman Lungren, but I do appreciate your leadership, Mr. Lungren, on these IP issues. So it's refreshing to hear what you had to say. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about what I do at the Global IP Center. What we are all about is promoting intellectual property rights in the United States and abroad. And then we're working hard to make sure that those rights, those laws, those norms are enforced vigorously in the international environment. And we do that because we believe IP, intellectual property, is the key to innovation. It's also key, of course, to saving lives, improving lives, addressing global challenges. But it's also critical to creating jobs, to driving our economy. United States innovative and creative industries depend on strong IP rights. And let me give you some stats to back that up. First of all, these industries, of course, which healthcare is a major part of that, employ over 18 million Americans. They account for more than $5 trillion of the nation's GDP. $5 trillion, that's more than the GDP of any other country in the world. They drive more than half of our exports and account for more than 40% of our nation's economic growth. Now, the life science industries alone, as you know, are very heavily dependent on intellectual property rights, and they contribute greatly to these numbers. Some other stats, though, that are important is that as of 2007, American scientists, researchers, and doctors were responsible for the creation of 70% of all new medicines. And from 2000 to 2004, the average worker in an IP-intensive industry like healthcare earned approximately 44% more than the average worker in a non-IP intensive industry. And oh, by the way, those numbers are only increasing as we've seen over the last few years. Now, of course, this isn't just pharmaceuticals, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but it's other technologies as well across the spectrum. Now, these are just the job and innovation numbers. The health impacts, as you know better than I do, are far more reaching. We have mortality rates for cancer and other diseases down. We have treatment of other chronic diseases are up. The ability to detect and identify and treat other problems are greatly enhanced, and the list goes on and on and on. The bottom line is, as Congressman Lungren said, IP marks American ingenuity. It's what makes us the most competitive nation in the world. It's what keeps us healthy, keeps society advancing. These are the benefits of a competitive free market where property rights are respected. With strong IP rights, inventors and researchers and companies will commit the time, the effort, the energy, the resources to invent, to create, because they know their ideas will be protected. And the same is true for the capital, the investors who support them, who put the money down up front. They know there will be a return on investment if there are intellectual property rights. Now, despite these achievements, or maybe because of them, our IP industries are under threat from three main groups, and I'm going to talk about two of them today. The three are governments, a handful of governments that for competitive purposes or industrial policy are trying to take our intellectual property, and the ones that come to mind readily are China and India. Anti-IP groups who are working to undermine IP rights and laws around the world. And then you have criminal organizations who are increasingly involved in counterfeiting and piracy. Now let me just talk about the two. The threat from governments. We see everything from compulsory licensing, which is a technical term for the legalized theft, in many cases, the expropriation of technologies and patents. And we've seen this in the past few years from countries such as Brazil and Thailand. We know that in countries like India and China, we see everything from poor patent protection to poor patent processing to lack of clinical testing, data protection, and so on. And then recently, in the last few months, we've seen new rules come out of Beijing that calls for indigenous innovation that would require that if you want to be part of a government contract there, you have to turn over to some degree or share your intellectual property. And it's all about getting an upper hand, about gaining our technology. Now, the threats from criminal groups are different, but in many ways worse. We've seen, in terms of counterfeit, everything from fake brake pads on cars to consumer electronics that catch fire as soon as you plug them in. But we also have fake medicines that are doing great harm to our country. According to a report out this week by the Institute for Policy Innovation, it said that developing countries and most African countries, the rate of fake medicines out there circulating is as high as 60%. 60%. The problem is only growing and becoming more sophisticated. In fact, the U.S.-based Center for Medicine in the Public Interest predicts that counterfeit drug sales will reach $75 billion globally in 2010, which is an increase of more than 90% since 2005. Now, on one hand, there are direct impacts on consumers that we'll talk about, but on the other hand, there are indirect ones as well. Needless to say, tens of billions of dollars in lost sales, our revenues that aren't going back into research and development, aren't going back into hiring new researchers and scientists. In fact, the opposite is happening in many cases. Now, why is the counterfeiting rate so high? Why is it increasing? It's pretty straightforward. First of all, it's relatively easy to do. Secondly, there are high profit margins on these items, particularly when you start looking at copyrighted materials such as CDs and DVDs. Third, which is an area where we work increasingly on, is in many countries, the laws are insufficient or the laws aren't enforced. So we tend to pay more attention to very important crimes such as traditional burglary and murder, of course, and things like that. But there's not resources or attention directed to counterfeiting. And yet, in the United States alone, this is over a $200 billion enterprise. Lastly, counterfeiting is hard to detect. The counterfeiters are very good. They'll make packages that look just like what you buy off the shelf. And the substances, unless you get inside of it, are really hard to determine what exactly is in there. Now, in the United States, counterfeiting rates are low, in the single digits. But those numbers are growing. And why? The internet. Now, combating counterfeiting is a top priority of the Global IP Center that I run. And the internet is a particular focus because of how rampant IP theft has become. Why? Because criminal organizations these days are able to reach more customers than they ever were before. They can make, instead of going on to a street corner in New York City and buying a fake Rolex or a fake handbag, now they can They can put websites up on the internet and reach you that way. They can also make you think it's the real thing, which is something they haven't been able to do in the past. Online sales of counterfeits are doing immense damage, not only to IP-based industries and workers, but consumers as well. And these are different types of harm. Now, on the street corner, it's one thing if you purchase a handbag or a watch from a guy and a month later it breaks. But if you're purchasing a fake medicine, which no one goes to a street corner and says, "Hey, buddy, you got some Lipitor," but when it involves prescription drugs on the internet, it's a completely different issue. Now, let me give you an example. Many people today are purchasing medicines online. Many of these folks are older Americans, our moms and dads and aunts and uncles, in search of lower cost drugs, easy access, to treat anything from high blood pressure to high cholesterol and so forth and so on. Much easier than jumping in the car, going to the pharmacy, standing in line, doing all that type of stuff. And it's easier because the medicines come right to your door, you open the package, and you're off to the races. Marcia Bergeron was a U.S. citizen living in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Vancouver Island, Canada, part of the year. Now, Marcia was your average 57-year-old, but she was taking a number of medications to treat a number of conditions, one of which was depression. She had access to the internet, and so we believe she jumped online, found an internet pharmacy, replete with all the proper markings, we believe, of what would be a legitimate site. She placed her order, received her meds. As soon after she started taking her medication, hair started falling out, stomach aches. Not long after that, she was found dead in her home on December 27th, 2006, just 2 days after Christmas. The toxicology tests done by the coroner's office revealed fatally high levels of the metals strontium, uranium, and lead in her bloodstream. These metals were found in the pills, likely lying next to her bedside. Now, police began an investigation into the online pharmacy, but they didn't get far. Why? Because these sites change often. They move, they change their banners. They're very careful to cover up their tracks. You see, many of these fake pharmaceuticals are made in the developing world. Back alleys, in garages, are mixed in a dirty tin pan. They're formed, they're put into proper marking and labeling, or at least what looks like that, and then are distributed across Eastern Europe and other parts of Asia, and they end up coming into our system here in the United States. They look authentic, and we can't tell the difference. The websites, too, often cases are very fake. They're waving Canadian flags to try and lure the patient to buy, and they give you the look and feel of a genuine drug. And unfortunately, this is the rule rather than the exception. Independent research tells us, and this group took a handful of drugs, and they tested this, and they found that of the 3,000 pharmaceutical sites found online today, guess how many are verified internet pharmacy practice sites, VIPS certified sites? Anybody want to take a guess out of 3,000? 4. So Marcia Bergeron's story isn't unique. It's tragic, yes, but it's not unique. And I'm just talking about fake medicines that kill you. We're not talking about the fake medicines that don't have sufficient efficacy, where people die every day, not because the medicine killed them, but it failed to cure them or failed to protect them, failed to do what it was supposed to do. Indeed, the estimated deaths around the world today due to counterfeit medicines are anywhere from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands. Now, we hear more of these facts and stories all the time. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, and it's frustrating because more can be done, more should be done to inform people, to shut down these illegal websites, and to put these counterfeiters out of business. That's what we're trying to do at the Global IP Center. That's why we're trying to enforce intellectual property rights. We're trying every day to take down these counterfeiters. We're also working to go after these countries, such as China and India, which are either trying to undermine IP laws and norms, promote the expropriation of patents, which leads to substandard medicines, or, unfortunately, again, are turning a blind eye to counterfeiting and piracy. Now, time is getting short, I know, and I've gone on, but let me give you a few ideas of what we think should be done and wrap up. First of all, this summer, we hope, the National IP Strategy will be coming out. The Obama administration has a prime opportunity this year to enhance the enforcement tools and efforts to curb IP theft by developing a comprehensive and effective national IP strategy as mandated by the 2008 Pro IP Act. The nation's first intellectual property enforcement coordinator, she was confirmed this past December, has been tasked with crafting this government-wide plan, the first ever of its kind, and has already begun soliciting public comments. So we're encouraged to see the administration's continued progress on this and look forward to the plan to be delivered this summer. Second, conclude the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. It's an agreement right now being worked between the United States and nearly 40 other partners, which will raise the bar on IP protection standards and help us harmonize and better coordinate our efforts as we try and stop counterfeiting and piracy. Third, we have to do a better job of enforcing our IP rights and laws, not only in the United States, but abroad, and dedicate the right resources to do that. And then fourth, we need the administration, with Congress's support, if not urging, to beat back bad ideas that come up in places like Geneva, where intellectual property law is debated, or other places around the world, whether it's Beijing or Brasilia or New Delhi, where folks are trying to undermine IP laws and norms. If we as the United States are going to continue to be competitive, if we're going to continue to lead the world and bring new medicines to market and new innovations to market, then we have to protect the innovation property rights that underlie that. Because one way or the other, counterfeiting and IP rights are critical to us and critical to our families. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn over the mic.
Excellent presentation. Morgan Reed is Executive Director of the Association for Competitive Technology. What an interesting idea. He has spent really his career in the intersection of government and technology and started out in Taiwan and China to dealing with governments, telecommunications groups, software manufacturers, and small business owners, but big business owners as well. He specializes in issues involving patents and copyrights, and we're really delighted to have you here with us, Morgan. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm going to try to be sensitive to the stomachs, obesity notwithstanding, and really take it short down. I'll quickly go over who we are. I'm Morgan Reed with the Association for Competitive Technology. We're a trade association that represents about 3,000 small and medium-sized businesses, almost entirely in the high-tech sector. My folks are the guys in the garage hoping to be the next Microsoft. And what we found is that they see health IT as the biggest opportunity on the face of the earth. So we've heard a lot of negatives and we've heard a lot of the downsides, and I agree with everything we heard from Lungren and Mr. Esper, but I'm here to preach the good news of money. I'm right, I'm on the New Testament. So we've heard, intellectual property is a key element to the future of the United States. It represents the way out. Now, a strange story, when Congressman Lungren was in the wilderness between jobs, he was a colleague of mine, and he taught me two things. One, the efficacy of Notre Dame is the best school on the face of the earth. And one of the most important things was make sure your audience goes away with a gee whiz fact, something they didn't know when they walked in the door. And we've heard about Article 1, Section 8 and its importance, and we've heard from Mark Esper about the size of the economic development. I'm going to give you one more gee whiz fact on copyrights, and that is copyright is the only place where the United States has a trade surplus. Intellectual property is the only place where the United States has a trade surplus with every nation in the world. We are the key innovator in the world economy. So we've heard about the problems with the U.S. healthcare system, and we've had lots of grumblings about what will meaningful use do. And yet when I was in Atlanta 3 weeks ago at the HIMSS conference, 30,000 people had boarded an airplane to fly to Atlanta, and it snowed there while we were there, to talk about electronic health records and the EHR systems that we were all going to be created. 30,000 people. A reporter for CNET noted that it felt more like 1999 than 2010. ONC says we will be 50,000 jobs short in the health IT area. 50,000 jobs. And these are the best kind of jobs. One, they're in America. Two, they're highly educated. And three, they pay well. So we've got this great system. America is moving forward on health IT. We see it as the way out. What's our next step? Well, we'll move through the legislation that's been created. We'll figure out how to spend the billions of dollars that are part of ARRA and deal with the meaningful use issues. But now, what do we do now from the United States perspective once we've solved our health IT problems here in the United States? How do we make more money? And I'd say we need to look away from our borders and figuring out how the United States can export the technology. There is no reason why the Canadian health IT system that they're using up in Canada shouldn't be coming from an American company. There were more than 900 vendors at the HIMSS conference that we just had on health IT. 900 vendors, each one with a solution, doing things that would interoperate with each other, trying to solve the problems of giving doctors an electronic health record that they can pass on. We know that there are going to be issues of privacy and security, and we know that the government is going to mandate all sorts of different either technology mandates or standard mandates, but we'll get through it. So what do we do to move beyond that? How do we move beyond? Well, in EHR alone, the export potential is enormous. According to a recent study, Canada had spent $1.6 billion on EHR in 2008, and by March of 2009, they'd already spent another $1.6 billion. The UK is expected to spend £20 billion on procuring health IT systems. Now, right now, Microsoft is currently running a program in the UK with the National Health System with their Amalga tool. And it's looking like a real up-and-comer. It's beating out the European competitors. So we've got 46% of the United States, the doctors aren't using EHR. We'll solve that problem. How does the opportunity look in the rest of the world? Well, right now, 99% of the Netherlands medical community is using EHR, electronic health records. New Zealand, 97%. The UK, 96%. Australia, 95%. Italy, 94%. Norway, 97%. Sweden, 94%. Every single one of those countries is an enormous opportunity. They're rich and they're willing to pay for better EHR systems. What about the ones that aren't already embedded? Well, Japan doesn't have a national EHR system yet, and the Japanese love technology. There's no reason that we shouldn't be selling more of our technology into Japan. What about Israel? Israel doesn't have one either national or private. We need to look at those as opportunities. And through the help of Congress and through the Chamber of Commerce, we need to be exploring ways that we can export that technology. Now, if this is such good news and I'm here to preach the opportunities, what are the things we have to do to make it happen? Well, there's three basic areas that we have in the United States that we need to overcome. Domestically, education. Remember I said we'll have 50,000 missing jobs, high-paying, well-educated jobs. We need to get people educated. Some of that's going to be local, some of that's going to be federal, but we need to do a better job of making sure we push through the kind of education that doctors need. And that also means input from the medical community about what are the things that you're seeing missing in the people you hire and the way that they manage health IT systems internally. Second, visas. There's just a bottom line reality. I know that if I were to ask people for the name of all the high-tech companies you can think of quickly, I guarantee you about 40% of them would have been started in the United States by people who came here from another country. H-1B visas and the proposed EB-5 visa are a great way for us to keep really smart people in the United States. The reality is right now, we bring people in from another country, we educate them up, we train them at our best institutions, including Notre Dame, and then we kick them out. Who in their right mind would develop a system where we pour our best resources into these up-and-comers, these entrepreneurs who left their home country, moved away from their family, and then we kick them out? That's just insane. And yet, that's what we do right now. So we must change our current process on the visa system. A quick anecdotal example. Microsoft, because they couldn't get enough visas, opened an office in Canada. They just went across the bridge from their offices in Washington State, put up a building, hired people moved there, have houses, and yet that's where the economy's growing. They have a growing base of Microsoft employees inventing the future of EHR, not in the United States, solely because of visa issues. Thirdly, tax credits and cap gain. Everybody understands that for political reasons, it's impossible to get R&D tax credit made permanent. But I'd like to once again throw it out and say we'd love to have permanent R&D tax credit, Congressman.
So would I.
And we'd also like to see
a majority. We will.
We'd also like to see cap gains move down. We see that right now one of the biggest problems with both R&D tax credit and the capital gains issue is the biggest risk takers. Congressman Lungren pointed out, risk takers are what we want to try to encourage. It's very punitive for you right now if you take the big risk and you succeed. Well, wouldn't you think that the best thing to do is if you make a bunch of money and you succeed and you have a great product on the market, the government comes and goes, wow. So what we need to do is get a little bit better. Now, no reason that those people can't pay at least some fair share. They have to do a better job with our capital gains in incentivizing risk takers to build the next era of industry. Now, stepping into the China issue just for a little bit as we look at the international side, we've talked about all the negatives, and I've personally had negotiations with the head of IPR for China, and they didn't go so well. But I think we need to look at China as an opportunity again. Just think of it this way. There are 1.25 billion people in China, roughly 1.3. If 25% of the Chinese live like Americans, they will be a larger purchaser of goods and services than the entire United States. And if there's one thing we know about business, business tends to be a little bit on the amoral side, let us say. If the business opportunity is there in China, then China will dictate the terms of standards, of FDAs, of how much red dye number 5 is in M&Ms. China will be leading that. So we need to now understand that China is going to be a huge potential market for EHR and IT systems, and frankly for drugs. We heard it earlier. So we need to get involved right now in figuring out a way to try to get the Chinese convinced it's in their best interests to improve their protection and their IP system. Stop telling them they have to do it for us. Figure out a way to tell it because they need it for themselves. Secondly, in order to do that, we need to do a better job. Of working with our friends. Now, we have lots of issues with the Europeans on intellectual property. If we think about the major high-tech companies out there, if you name them, with the exception of SAP, how many can you name that are entirely European? The Europeans have an interest in basically maintaining a push down on the U.S. high-tech industry. Why not? Google, Microsoft, Oracle, in the case of medicine, McKesson. These are all U.S.-based companies. Many of them based in California, because we all know Californians are better at innovating. But some of them are even from Seattle and places outside of that. So where's the motivation for the Europeans to cooperate with us on IP? How do we go to them and say, hey, it's in your economic best interest to help us? Again, China. The Europeans share far more in common with us when it comes to red dye number 5 and how much lead goes in your paint than they do with the Chinese. So it's in the European interest, both economically and quality of life issues, to find ways to work better with us on patent harmonization, on standards, and on areas where we can build interoperability without forcing tech mandates. So we need to work closer with our friends in order to put pressure on our competitors instead of enemies. And last but not least, I want to save your stomach, so Mark's done a great job of talking about what we need to do in WIPO and WTO and all those acronym soups of international organizations. But I would put one more plea in to say that one of the things that an administration can do is put the heavy hand on folks to say, let's find a way to cooperate better. So with that, I'd say, let's do a better job and let's go out and make some money.
What a fabulous panel. This conference, and I give Jamie Burke and Sterling the credit. It's like a fine symphony. It keeps getting better as you go along to a real crescendo. Thank you all very much. I think we have time for maybe just one question, and I see lunch has been set up in the back. And is there anybody who hasn't asked a question? Then okay, go ahead. Jeff, could you have the microphone? Thanks, Jeff.
One question that I have regarding health IT is some of the challenges are that many physicians, especially who have solo private practices, there are still some left, have issues with interstate data transfer based on the state medical societies or the state medical boards' restrictions on health information. And I don't know if this is something that the panel can necessarily answer, but it's more food for thought. We have on one hand the federal government, and we have private industry getting on board with health IT and having more nationalized data sets or transfer of health information. But it's also at the state and local level getting them on board, especially with interstate practices developing. It's just something I just wanted to mention that.
I'll give a really short answer. A lot of it's wrapped up in the privacy and security issues. And that is absolutely an area where the federal government, through the Interstate Commerce Clause, has to do a better job in managing those issues. At the HIMSS conference, there were numerous speakers as we went through the battle on meaningful use. A lot of people brought up the issues that you did on what are the state implications. We know that 90% of the solo practices and the small practices in the United States are not completely converted to electronic health records. But the insurance companies are going to end up making them go that way, because right now it's surprising how many of them actually have to file paperwork and then get a paper check back from the insurance company that they then have to take to the bank. So little issues like that, getting your money in the bank faster, I think will make a big difference. As far as the issues on security and privacy that we need to solve, you're absolutely right. It's an issue that we're going to have to go to the federal government to deal with on some of the patchwork of state issues. Preemption is maybe one of the few ways that the government, that there is a need for government intervention at the federal level, and that's something that will be taken a look at.
I would just think that we can take care of those privacy issues from an interstate standpoint to the extent that we can take care of them. I think a more practical question is how do you get doctors who are sole practitioners or in small practices to involve themselves in this kind of a transfer of their information, because it costs them money. If they have a significant part of their practice, which is Medicare going to reimburse for that cost? It's not an easy thing. You've got a doctor in a small practice. He's got a receptionist. He has a nurse. He or she has a nurse. You have one person that does your billing. Are you going to hire an additional person to do this transfer and to be able to operate it? And what I've heard from some sole practitioners is, if I train somebody, I put in several tens of thousands of dollars to train them. My turnover is about once every 3 years. So do I do it? So I mean, that to me is the far more difficult problem. How do you make it in the economic interest of the sole practitioners or the small practice professionals to do that? And government, as we are cutting back on reimbursements and so forth, we're moving in the opposite direction. Could I just make one statement? Because this is called intelligent health. You have to realize what we're dealing with. When I was on the floor of the House on the debate this weekend, and we had the big issue of the Bart Stupak amendment and so forth, I made a plea to my Democratic colleagues on the other side of that issue, and I thought I would try and go back in some English literature. So what I did was I said, you all remember the story of Man for All Seasons, which was the famous play about Sir Thomas More. And I said, remember that great scene where he is about to be led back to be interrogated by Henry VIII, and he sees Richard Rich, his former protege, over in the corner, who has basically turned on him. And Richard Rich has a medallion on his chest, and it indicates that he's just been made the Attorney General of Wales. See, so there was trading back and forth in those days too. And Thomas More looks at him and he says, Richard, he said, it profits a man nothing if he gives up his soul for a country, but for Wales? I got several calls in the next few days from PETA complaining that I'm not making this up, that I did not protect Wales. And I heard a conversation in my office. One of my staffers was saying, no, it's W-A-L-E-S. No, that happens to be a country. Now, the reason I tell you this is, in debates on healthcare, even an intelligent debate on healthcare, sometimes you have to realize that you're not talking with the same vocabulary as others, and you may have to back up a little bit and lay your premise down before you get to your conclusion. But I will tell you, I thought to myself, I know it was a few years ago, I mean it was a few decades ago, it was an award-winning, Academy Award-winning film. I thought I explained it. But for Wales, just an indication of how tough the debate is sometimes.
Well, I think that this panel and this conference have shown that there is great intelligence in our health sector. And there is tremendous potential. And we are all obligated to protect and nurture the climate for this innovation so that it can continue, all of our lives will depend upon it. So I want to thank you all thank our panel, and we'll break for lunch just very quickly. We want to start our luncheon panel, Operating Room of the Future, right away. And so thank you. Please join me in thanking our terrific panel. Thank you.